All right, my beauties and bees, who is ready for an installment of Bres Bestiary, where we look at an animal of my choice and how they've evolved and interacted with humans, and especially when we've changed their biology. I'm really interested in it. So you'll see a lot of domestic animals coming up here in Bres Bestiary, but we'll branch out into wild animals as well, of course, and animals with their wild ancestors are always going to come up. Today, we are looking at I don't want to say some special content, but something that just recently was brought to my attention, and it kind of made me sad for them, so I wanted to read you guys about it. So this was an essay written by somebody else, of course, so I'm not going to take credit for it, but let me read right along. My husband grew up in New England, where they have pigeons. Apparently they hate them. He was always saying bad things about pigeons until I pointed out something that he never thought of before. We domesticated pigeons. They're nearly all over the world because humans brought them there. And they were more than pets. They carried messages. People raced them. They lived spoiled lives as honored human companions for centuries. Then we got telephones and threw them out like trash. We literally threw them away. This species had already been fully domesticated, and they could not survive in the wild. They lost all their survival instinct during the centuries they lived caged by people. This is why they only live in cities with people instead of the forest somewhere. It's our fault. And not only did we throw them away, but now humans curse them as winged rats, casting them as pests. But they don't know how to live without us. And their instinct tells them that they should trust us. So they continue to come to humans and beg for food, because it's the only survival skill left in their genes. They love us because they were bred by us to feel that way. Yet we hate them. And that really touched me, reading that and knowing that about pigeons and their contribution to humanity for so long. Now, I found a few channels that talk about the history of pigeons, but this one specifically I liked because the guy talks about their history in use in war, which always interests me. War animals are, especially oddball war animals, are always interesting to me, or animals that were used for some servile purpose during conflicts too.
Is the smallest soldier to have been awarded a medal in the Second World War. Your guess might not go as low as 9 ounces. Homing pigeons have been used in war since antiquity, but their role continued surprisingly.
Yeah, this is the history guy, by the way. He pulls his stuff up here so you can see who I'm watching.
Well into the era of mighty machines. And the wartime contributions of homing pigeons is history that deserves to be remembered. Fossil evidence suggests that the rock dove, Columba livia, the wild bird that is most commonly called simply a pigeon, originated in Southeast Asia. But the species has had such a long association with humans that it is today impossible to determine its original range. In fact, most experts assume that the pigeon is the world's oldest domesticated bird, with its domestic...
That would be older than chickens, which comes as a surprise to a lot of people. But yeah, when we ate pigeons too, I mean, that's an important thing to remember as well. and we figured out how to control them pretty easy.
Mentioned in both Mesopotamian cuneiform tablets and Egyptian hieroglyphs more than 5,000 years ago. Domesticated as both food.
Just like Robert was just saying in the side chat. Yep, they eated them too. Squab.
And as pets, humans have spread the species far and wide. Millions of the domesticated pigeons have become feral, interbreeding with their wild counterparts, to the point where the bird's range covers nearly 5 million square miles, and the European population alone is estimated to be as high as 28 million. 5,000 years of breeding resulted in many fancy breeds. The ability to breed for traits fascinated, among many others, Charles Darwin, who owned a flock and was a member.
So, I actually had a neighbor up until 2018 when I lived in Missouri who, he was retired, actually a retired cop, but that's neither here nor there. But he raised different fancy pigeons. He had all kinds of pigeons. He would like rent them out to weddings and stuff, but people would pay for them, and then when they let him go at the wedding, they just fly back to him and fly back and get in it and go back to his coop. But they like roamed the neighborhood, pretty feral. And they do pinwheel. He had ones that did pinwheels in the air, and ones that had big feathery legs, and ones that had almost peacock-like tails. Just a wide variety of them. But I remember one thing. He was complaining about somebody's cat. And my kids had, it was my son's cat, I think. It was my son's or my daughter's cat. Either way, my son's the one that was engaging with them. But they didn't take we didn't let our cats outside just to roam free. We'd like, if you took your cat outside, you had to monitor it and walk with it and stuff. And he threatened to shoot my son's cat because he was afraid it was going to get his free-range birds that free-ranged across the neighborhood. So, yeah, I had to remind him that his birds were basically free-range feral animals. It was within city ordinance, but if they're not on his property and a cat gets them, if a cat gets one of your pigeons when it lands on my property and it's my kid's cat, you don't have a leg to stand on, pal.
Member of pigeon clubs. Pigeons impacted his work, and he used them as examples of variation of animals under domestication. While many were bred for decoration and some for food, others were bred to select for the species' extraordinary capacity for homing. Homing is an inherent ability of an animal species to navigate towards an original location through unfamiliar areas. Homing can be used in migration, a way to return home, common in birds, but also salmon and logred sea turtles, and the tiny red-bellied gnu, which is just 3.5 inches long.
Hey, Nikki, good to see you, girl. I need to get back on one of your panels. We need to hang out.
Will travel sometimes miles over rugged terrain to return to the same spot in a stream. Homing in pigeons is a bit of a mystery, as the rock dove is not migratory, but the pigeons do have an ability to return home to their mate and nest. The most popular theory is that homing pigeons use magnetoreception, navigation by using the Earth's magnetic field, although the exact mechanism for how they detect the field is still a matter of debate, and some studies have found pigeons are able to return home even if the magnetic field is disrupted. Other cues, from olfactory navigation to navigating by visual landmarks, has also been suggested. In fact, it is possible that different types of homing pigeons use different types of navigation.
That'd be pretty wild. I would think that, and this is just speculation on my part, that they would have multiple layers of navigating abilities, both visual and electromagnetic, maybe even responses to the air currents and things. But yeah, like if you, like in light of that, I wonder if like climate change would be disruptive more so than changing the magnetic frequency.
But whatever the mechanism, homing is an exceptionally easy characteristic to breed for. You simply let the birds out and only breed the ones that make it back. The incentive to breed for the home...
That is self-regulating, right? That's actually natural selection to an extent, right? That's taking advantage of natural selection. And if you let them out, the ones that come back are the ones to breed. Those are the homing ones.
Homing skill came from the sport of pigeon racing, releasing pigeons to see which returns to its nest the fastest. While it isn't clear exactly when the sport was developed, it was at least well established in the time of King Solomon, some 3,000 years ago. The homing skill could be effective over a...
So yeah, King Solomon. So keep that in mind. This was prominent in the ancient Middle East and Near East and Egypt, India, Southeast Asia.
enormous distances, with some races occurring over distances in excess of 1,000 miles and with sustained speeds in excess of 50 miles per hour. The corollary to pigeon racing is the pigeon post, the use of pigeons to send messages, where their speed and homing ability made them superior to almost all means of communication before the electronic era. There is record of Cyrus the Great, king of Persia, using homing pigeons to communicate across the vast Persian Empire some 2,500 years ago, and pigeons were used in ancient Olympic games to alert a winner's hometown of their victory. The use of a pigeon for...
That is so cool. It's like they had, I mean, we had an animal that we could do this with, right? This animal was our communication device. Instead of being able to text your friend or call your friend or even drop a letter in the mail, you would tie it to a bird and it would fly from your location to their location or to a location in their town, and they would go get it. That is so cool.
For post has a limit in that, in general, the pigeon only homes one direction, has to be physically moved to the second location, and their size limits the size of the message they may carry. However, by placing their food in one location and their nest in another, pigeons have been able to be trained to fly back and forth between two locations over distances as much of about 100 miles. A version of a pigeon post was active in Baghdad at least as early as the 12th century, and a pigeon post was used by Genghis Khan to keep track of his empire in the 13th century. Pigeon posts were used as late as the 19th century between the California mainland.
The Great Khan did it. I mean, that's the Great Khan. No Khan greater.
And the town of Avalon on Catalina Island. A homing pigeon service in the 1890s between Great Barrier Island and Auckland, New Zealand, called a pigeongram, issued stamps, making it, some argue, the first real airmail service. The rare stamps are highly prized today by philatelists. Less successful was a late 19th century pigeon post used for marine search and rescue in Nova Scotia, where pigeons were flown from lighthouses on islands to the mainland. Because of the harsh conditions, the pigeon suffered a high mortality rate. When Paris was besieged...
Yeah, the American coast, I guess, is a little too rough for pigeon post.
By the Prussian army during the Franco-Prussian War in 1870 and 71, Parisians communicated with the outside world using pigeons, and the Prussians employed trained hawks to disrupt the service.
Ha.
As microphotographs have been developed in the 1850s, pigeons could carry hundreds of messages on a small roll, and more than 1 million messages were sent via pigeon during the 4-month siege.
That's amazing, too, what they were capable of in the 19th century as far as compressing their messages down to micro rolls like that. And using hawks as a countermeasure, that's brilliant. Sure beats the heck out of using shotguns.
Their reliability and speed, it's not surprising that homing pigeons have been used in time of war. In the 10th century, Olga of Kiev, the regent of Kiev and Rus, demanded a tribute of 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows from each house from the besieged residents of the Drevlian city of Iskorosten in exchange for ending the siege. Instead of ending the siege and bringing peace as promised, she had a small cloth of sulfur and pitch bound to each bird, and when they returned to their homes, they set the city ablaze, burning it to ashes.
Yeah, that's messed up. Basically sending flaming pigeons back at them. Insane. Cruel. They used to do that with pigs too. That's one of the things that they said that they did to stem the Persians and to stem the Carthaginians with their war elephants. The Romans would cover a pig in pitch, which is oil, and then set it on fire, and it run screaming into the troop of elephants, and they would freak out because they're afraid of fire and afraid of the pig screaming. Pigs under castle walls, dripping with pitch. Yep, they sure would. People were cruel to pigs, and apparently pigeons too. Turned them into fire bombs.
During the Second World War, behaviorist B.F. Skinner theorized that a pigeon could be conditioned to recognize a target and drive a glider laden with explosives, essentially pecking out of control when the glider moved off target. While this early attempt at a guided missile attracted some military interest, the so-called Project Pigeon was eventually abandoned as being impractical.
Could you imagine if we had pigeon-guided missiles? There was a period of time where we had pigeon-guided missiles. What even? What even is this? What kind of world would that be? Could you imagine it? Like, you always hear about steampunk and Z-Rust and all these different versions of alternative realities where technology was different. What a clockwork or clockwork punk or clock punk or something like that. Anyway, all these different ones. Why is there no animal powered punk? What would you call it? What do you call? Is there a word for animal power? Is there a word? I'm gonna ask the AI. Like a specific word. I know draft, but for animal, because we were using animals a long time before we conquered electricity and stuff. Like if you look at the grinding mills, we used like draft animals like donkeys or oxen to turn our mills, to till the soil, just to produce energy. Horsepower, yeah, there's that. Bioenergy, animal power, I guess is just what they call it. Just animal power.
Compared to competing projects. In 1908, a German apothecary named Julius Neubauer developed a small camera that could be set with a timer and attached to a pigeon for the purpose of aerial photography. The German army investigated the military potential, but by the Great War, aerial technology had developed to the point that airplanes were a better platform. Still, the idea persisted into the Second World War, when the German army apparently trained dogs to carry a pigeon in a basket behind enemy lines. The pigeons then flew back to the German lines with cameras that took photos at 5-minute intervals.
So you have dogs and pigeons working together, like teamwork. You'd have to really train that dog good so it doesn't eat the pigeon when it gets out and starts taking pictures. This would be a good kids cartoon. You could be a pigeon and a dog behind enemy lines. The enemies could be lions, and it could be called Behind Enemy Lions. And you could have like maybe the tigers and the lions at war, and then they hire the dog and the pigeon to go behind enemy lions. Okay, now I'm just creating my own little fictional story.
While the Soviet Army reported capturing a German truck that included cameras and equipment for pigeon photography in 1942, it's unclear how much they were actually used. The U.S. Central Intelligence Agency developed...
Ooh, it's just called Animal Engine? Okay. Could you imagine if like early tanks and planes and stuff were run by animal power? Could you imagine?
A pigeon camera during the 1970s for use during the Cold War. Reports are that the pigeons would be dropped from airplanes. The details of the camera and the results of the program are still...
That's kind of what the Flintstones is, though. Beast punk, Ring. You make a good point. Because the Flintstones world is like that, right? They're all dinosaurs, but, I mean, they're not all dinosaurs. There's other animals, too. There's mammoths and saber-tooths and even some modern animals like kangaroos and stuff. So they're not... yeah, well, like Dinotopia, but Dinotopia, the dinosaurs and the people kind of coexist as sentient beings together, right? I'm talking about where we've completely domesticated animals into being basically parts of our machinery. Because yeah, where we use their abilities and natural powers to function in the world, like the Flintstones. Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. Because I would call the Flintstones beast punk. Let's coin the term beast punk, and we're going to call the Flintstones our quintessential source material, and we're going to expand on it from there.
Classified. But the most successful use of war pigeons was as a messenger. The use of messenger pigeons in war is ancient, and there are several references in Roman texts of pigeons being used by Julius Caesar to communicate with his armies during the Gallic Wars. Hannibal took pigeons with him to keep Carthage appraised of his progress as he crossed the Alps. When the British defeated Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, a pigeon was the first to carry the news of the victory to London. By the 1800s, pigeons were an established part of every major European army.
See, we wouldn't necessarily need things as big as a horse to power the tank either. You could have something like a fox, something just with the power of a fox, and we'll use like Rube Goldberg mechanics to make it so that it powers the tank. So we'll actually use the motion of the fox and just keep amplifying it. Yes, and that'll be our beast punk.
The greatest use of pigeons in war was during the Great War. On the cusp of the electronic age, the war featured old and new technology. Where conditions made it impossible to string wires and radio technology was undependable, pigeons were a relatively reliable form of communication, with some claiming that they achieved a success rate of more than 95%. Mm-hmm. Estimates are that as many as 500,000 pigeons were utilized during the war. Pigeons were an important part of the new technologies of the war. Aircraft and tanks were fast-moving and often discovered urgent information to carry back to headquarters. Radios of the day were too large and unreliable to be carried, and pigeons were carried by both, as well as by warships. When the U.S. first deployed tanks under Major George Patton at the Battle of Seminole, the lead company sent a pigeon.
There's a pigeon port on the side of the tank. We were just talking about tanks, and now there's a pigeon port on the side of one. So the tank is full of pigeons.
Named President Wilson back to headquarters with a map of the location of German machine gun nests. Pilots found that they could throw pigeons out at any altitude and they would successfully fly home, although you had to throw them carefully to keep them from hitting parts of the aircraft. Pigeons were such an important means of communication on both sides that troops would shoot at them, knowing that they were carrying messages. Some troops were issued shotguns for exactly that purpose.
Aww.
In at least one case,
they didn't use the Falcons like their predecessors did. That might have been a good option to shoot them with some, or to hit them with some Peregrine Falcons. Good countermeasure for pigeon messengers.
An American spy camouflaged a white pigeon named Babette with soot, so it would appear to be a crow, making it less likely that the Germans would target it. The pigeon made it back to headquarters with information about a German attack, allowing the Allies to thwart the attack with artillery. A pigeon named Le Cirque was credited with capturing a German submarine. When a French beach watcher sighted a German periscope off the coast, Le Cirque got a message back to Naval Command so quickly that British and American destroyers were able to trap the submarine and force it to surrender.
War
the
pigeons!
Famous Lost Battalion of the U.S. 77th Infantry was trapped behind enemy lines during the Battle of the Meuse in 1918.
Yeah, so these are little soldiers. Some of these are going to get medals and stuff, too. Some of these pigeons deserve medals, but for some of the stuff
cut off from other means of communication. A pigeon named Cher Ami, or Best Friend, flew through enemy fire to alert command as to the battalion's location. The timely message saved the battalion from a misplaced Allied artillery barrage that was dropping on the lost battalion.
You won't hear about the hero pigeons from the Axis, though. They probably have their own hero pigeons that they were good boys, too. Good boys are good girls. Didn't know they were, the Germans had dogs that were good boys. There were no Nazi animal soldiers. There were animal soldiers pressed by the Nazis. Let's say that.
And allowed the Allies to advance enough to withdraw the battalion. Cher Ami carried the message 25 miles in 25 minutes, despite having been wounded by German fire, having lost a leg with a hole through her breast. For her courage, she was awarded the Croix de Guerre by the French. Surgeons saved Cher Ami, including providing her with a wooden leg. She returned to be part of the Army breeding program, and after her death in 1919, was taxidermied and is on display at the Smithsonian Institution.
Neat.
Despite the...
I want to go to the Smithsonian pretty soon. It's on my to-do list. I'd love to go to the Smithsonian. I want to go to the Smithsonian with Ben and Maya. I want to make that a thing that we do together when I go out east. Get all you guys together and go to the Smithsonian so I can nerd out about history stuff with you guys.
Advance of radio communication, homing pigeons still played a vital role in the Second World War. The Royal Air Force carried pigeons with bomber crews, where they were a reliable means of informing headquarters when a plane had crashed. The RAF estimated that 1 in every 7 of its bomber crewmen who were rescued after being shot down over the ocean were rescued as a result of a message sent by a pigeon. In one case...
Do you imagine floating in the ocean with your box with a pigeon in it, trying to write your little note of your coordinates to tie on to the pigeon? And the pigeon's like, nah, I'm going to get out of here. You're floating in the ocean.
The crew of a Beaufort bomber shot down over the North Sea in 1942 was rescued because their pigeon, a bird named Winky, managed to make it home despite being covered in oil. Winky didn't have a message attached, but the RAF were able to calculate the position of the downed aircraft using the time difference between the plane's ditching and the arrival of the bird.
Winky is a total badass. Covered in pitch. She didn't get cut on fire, though.
Pigeons were so valuable in airborne operations, where communication could be notoriously spotty, that the U.S. engaged a brassiere manufacturer to create a special sling so that a pigeon could be carried by a paratrooper. A cage with a parachute was also developed to allow planes to drop pigeons to isolated troops, and prior to the D-Day invasion in 1944, thousands of such pigeons were dropped throughout the countryside, asking French citizens to reply with information about the location of German forces. Pigeons played a vital...
What happens if the German forces find those, though? Yeah. Yeah, the bat bombs. There were bug bombs, too. I covered that. Release the Bugs of War was the video. If you are interested in seeing that, I covered how insects were used in war like this, too.
If almost unknown role at D-Day, as there was a concern that radio communications were being monitored by the Germans. An Irish pigeon named Paddy was the fastest pigeon to return to England with news of the success of the D-Day landing, traveling 230 miles across the English Channel in less than 5 hours. For his speed in the delivery, Paddy was awarded the Dickon Medal, called the Victoria Cross for Animals, one of 32 pigeons to be so honored during the Second World War. Another pigeon to receive the award was G.I. Joe, who in November 1943 was able to successfully carry a message when all other means had failed. The Allies had called...
Bet you didn't know your action figure was named after a pigeon, did ya? Real American hero.
in an air bombardment on German troops in the Italian village of Colvi Vecchia. But the Germans had withdrawn at the last minute, and the village had been occupied by British forces. The Americans realized their bombers were about to bomb Allied troops, but were unable to successfully raise command by radio. G.I. Joe made the trip successfully in 20 minutes, arriving just in time to call off the bombers. Pigeons dropped behind the lines with paratroopers were commonly used to communicate with resistance units. One such pigeon, named Commando, successfully completed more than 90 missions.
These pigeons sure have some macho names. I guess it is the war, the Great War, right? Or the Great War was the World War One. What is World War Two? It's not called the Great War. They did call it World War Two during the actual event. World War One wasn't called World War One during World War One. It was just, they just called it the Great War, or the war to end all wars. Ironically enough, because World War Two was coming, and it was much worse. Yeah.
Pigeons carried in mobile dovecotes were used on all fronts. A pigeon named Blackie Harrington successfully carried a message during the Battle of Guadalcanal regarding the location of Japanese troops, despite being hit with shrapnel that tore off part of his neck and chest. Surgeons were able to save Blackie, who spent the rest of his days in the breeding program.
Some of these pigeons kept going after they'd been the tough birds. They are tough birds. I guess that's why they say that you can't make it. If you can make it in New York, you can make it anywhere. Nobody makes it in New York better than a pigeon.
Underappreciated war pigeon is no longer used by most armies. The U.S. Army Signal Corps shut down their pigeon service in 1947, and the British Air Ministry pigeon section was shut down in 1948. But the Swiss Army maintained a pigeon section clear until 1996. There's been some indication that homing pigeons might have been used as part of asymmetric warfare in recent years, and pigeons have been caught being used to smuggle things into prisons. And there is a current concern that homing pigeons might be used as a method to deliver bioweapons. White doves, which are sometimes traditionally released as a celebration of weddings and at the opening ceremonies of Olympic Games, are actually homing pigeons that have been bred for their size and their color. And they're supposed to be able to return home, although because they haven't been bred for their homing ability, a distressing number of them don't make it. Still...
Generally they do. Like I said, my neighbor had these, the fancy pigeons. And there were ones with fluffy tails too, but they mostly come home. He didn't lose a lot of them.
It is an interesting irony that a technology developed for war has become an international symbol of peace and love. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History.
Yeah, the history guy is pretty cool, so check him out. Hopefully I cut in enough that he doesn't feel like I'm stealing his content. But I'm a big fan of pigeons and these birds, and some things about pigeons that I think are interesting. Some factoids here. Just gonna drop at the end. There was of course the passenger pigeons, which went from being the most abundant bird on Earth to extinct within a matter of just a few years. The dodo bird is also a pigeon. If you didn't know that, it is a pigeon. That's what happens to a pigeon when it's allowed to prosper in an island habitat with no predators. Thank you so much for joining me for Bre's Bestiary today, where we looked at the history of pigeons and mankind together, for better or for worse. Thank you for joining. Please remember to be kind, take care, and we will see you next time.